The gavel fell with a thunderous crack that echoed through the packed Town Hall of Millbrook, Pennsylvania. The year was 1892, and desperation hung in the smoky air like the cold dust that perpetually settled on every surface in this industrial town. Emma Carter stood on the wooden platform, her hands trembling as hundreds of eyes devoured her with a hunger that made her stomach turn. The auctioneer's voice boomed across the crowd, calling out numbers that represented not cattle or farmland, but her very future, her body, her soul. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. What had brought this 17-year-old girl to such a horrifying moment? How had a town that prided itself on Christian values come to auction off a young woman like livestock? And why, at the very moment when all hope seemed lost, did the temperature in that sweltering hall suddenly drop 20 degrees, causing every person present to see their breath mist in the air like ghostly whispers? The answer lies in a tale of crushing poverty, family loyalty, and a love that transcends even death itself. A story that will make you question everything you think you know about sacrifice, redemption, and the unbreakable bonds that tie us to those we've lost. The autumn of 1892 had arrived in Millbrook like an unwelcome visitor, bringing with it the kind of bone-deep chill that seemed to seep through the wooden walls of the Carter farmhouse no matter how many logs William Carter fed to the dying fire. The coal mines that had once provided steady work for the men of the town had been shutting down one by one, leaving families scrambling for survival as the industrial boom that had built their community crumbled beneath the weight of economic collapse. Emma Carter had grown accustomed to the sound of her father's boots, pacing the kitchen floor at night, the heavy thud of each step marking time with his mounting desperation. She would lie in her narrow bed, listening to the whispered conversations between her parents that always seemed to end with her mother's muffled sobs and her father's frustrated sighs. The farm that had supported their family for 3 generations was mortgaged to the hilt, and the bank notices that arrived with increasing frequency bore the stern signature of Marcus Blackwood, the wealthiest man in Millbrook and the owner of nearly half the town's remaining businesses. 3 months earlier, Samuel Carter had been the hope of the family. At 19, he possessed the kind of natural charm and business sense that seemed to promise a way out of their financial predicament. He had secured a position at the newly opened textile mill in the neighboring town of Riverside, sending home nearly every penny of his wages to help pay down the family's mounting debts. His letters had been filled with optimism and plans for the future, describing his promotion to floor supervisor and his intentions to eventually start his own business. Then came the telegram that shattered their world in a way that no amount of financial hardship could have prepared them for. Samuel had been killed in a machinery accident at the mill, his body crushed beneath a massive loom that had broken free from its moorings during the night shift. The mill owners had expressed their condolences and offered a settlement of $50, an amount so insulting that William Carter had torn up the check and thrown the pieces into the fireplace. Emma remembered the day they brought Samuel home for burial, his coffin carried by 6 men from the church who had known him since childhood. The funeral had been held on a gray October morning, with half the town in attendance to pay their respects to a young man who had represented hope, not just for his own family, but for everyone struggling to survive in these difficult times. Emma had stood at the graveside, watching as they lowered her brother into the cold earth, and had made a silent promise that she would find a way to honor his memory and save their family from ruin. But promises made at gravesides, she was learning, were far easier to make than to keep. In the weeks following Samuel's death, the family's financial situation had deteriorated from desperate to catastrophic. Without his income, they had fallen further behind on their mortgage payments, and Marcus Blackwood had made it clear that his patience was wearing thin. The banker had begun appearing at their door with increasing frequency, his expensive suits and polished shoes, a stark contrast to the worn clothing and worried faces of the Carter family. Emma had taken on additional work wherever she could find it, cleaning houses for the wealthier families in town and taking in sewing from women who could afford to pay someone else to mend their clothes. Her hands, once soft and smooth, had become rough and calloused from the constant labor, and her back ached from bending over washboards and sewing machines from dawn until well past dusk. Yet no matter how many hours she worked or how carefully she counted every penny, it was never enough to make a meaningful dent in their debt. The other families in Millbrook were facing similar struggles, which meant that work was scarce and wages were constantly falling as people grew more desperate. Emma had watched as the Henderson family had packed their belongings into a single wagon and left town in the middle of the night, abandoning their farm to the bank rather than face the shame of public foreclosure. The Morrison children had stopped attending school because their parents could no longer afford to buy them shoes for the approaching winter. Even the church, which had traditionally provided assistance to struggling families, was running short of funds as donations dwindled, along with everyone's ability to give. It was during one of these particularly bleak evenings that Marcus Blackwood had made his proposal. Emma had been alone in the house, her parents having gone to town to meet with the preacher about organizing a community fundraiser, when she heard the heavy knock on the front door. She had opened it to find Blackwood standing on their porch, his tall frame silhouetted against the darkening sky. He was a man in his 40s, with graying hair and cold blue eyes that seemed to take inventory of everything they looked upon. His reputation in town was that of a shrewd businessman who had managed to prosper even as others struggled, though there were whispers about the methods he used to acquire properties from families who could no longer afford to keep them. Blackwood had removed his hat and stepped into their modest parlor without being invited, his gaze sweeping over the worn furniture and faded wallpaper with the calculating look of a man appraising property for purchase. When he spoke, his voice was smooth and cultured, with the kind of educated accent that marked him as someone who had come from better circumstances than most of the town's residents. He had explained that he was aware of their financial difficulties and had come to offer what he called a mutually beneficial arrangement. The family's debt to his bank had grown to nearly $800, a sum that would have taken them years to repay, even under the best of circumstances. He was prepared to forgive the entire debt, he said, and even provide additional compensation that would allow them to keep their farm and live comfortably for years to come. The condition was simple. Emma would agree to become his wife and bear him the children that his previous wife had been unable to provide before her death 3 years earlier. Emma had listened to his proposal with growing horror, her hands clenched so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had turned white. Blackwood had spoken of the arrangement as though it were a business transaction, discussing her youth and beauty as assets that would complement his wealth and social position. He had mentioned his desire for sons to carry on his name and inherit his properties, and had assured her that she would be well provided for and would want for nothing as his wife. The age difference between them, he had noted with a slight smile, would ensure that she would be properly guided and would learn to appreciate the finer things in life that his wealth could provide. When Emma had finally found her voice, it had come out as barely more than a whisper as she told him that she needed time to consider his offer. Blackwood had nodded as though he had expected this response, and had informed her that he would need her answer within 1 week. If she declined his proposal, he would have no choice but to proceed with foreclosure proceedings on their farm, and he doubted that any other family in town would be in a position to take them in during such difficult times. After he had left, Emma had sat alone in the growing darkness, too stunned to light the oil lamps or stoke the fire that was slowly dying in the grate. When her parents had returned home, she had been unable to bring herself to tell them about Blackwood's visit, instead claiming that she had spent the evening working on mending clothes for Mrs. Patterson down the road. She had gone to bed that night with Blackwood's words echoing in her mind, and had barely slept as she struggled to comprehend the impossible choice that had been laid before her. Over the following days, Emma had found herself studying her parents with new eyes, noticing details that she had previously overlooked. Her father's shoulders seemed more stooped than before, and she could see the weight of responsibility pressing down on him like a physical burden. Her mother had developed a persistent cough that she tried to hide, but Emma suspected it was brought on by the stress and worry that consumed their household. They had both aged years in the months since Samuel's death, and Emma realized that the loss of their farm would likely destroy what remained of their health and spirits. She had also begun to notice the way that other families in town looked at them with a mixture of sympathy and relief, grateful that their own circumstances, while difficult, had not yet reached the level of desperation that the Carters were facing. The women at church would offer kind words and promises of prayers, but Emma could see in their eyes that they were already mentally distancing themselves from a family that seemed doomed to fall into the category of the town's unfortunate poor. It was on the 4th day after Blackwood's visit that Emma had made her decision. She had been working in the small vegetable garden behind their house, harvesting the last of the potatoes before the first frost, when she had felt a sudden chill in the air that seemed to come from nowhere. The afternoon sun had been shining brightly just moments before, but suddenly the garden was cast in shadow as though a large cloud had passed overhead. Emma had looked up to see clear skies, but the feeling of being watched had been so strong that she had turned around, half expecting to see someone standing behind her. Instead, she had seen nothing but the weathered headstone that marked Samuel's grave in the small family cemetery plot at the edge of their property. Her brother had been buried there according to his own wishes, expressed in one of his last letters home, where he had written about his desire to rest forever on the land that had shaped his childhood. Emma had found herself walking toward the grave without making a conscious decision to do so, drawn by a feeling that she couldn't quite name or understand. Standing beside Samuel's headstone, Emma had spoken aloud for the first time about the choice she was facing. She had told her brother about Blackwood's proposal, about the impossible situation their family was in, and about her growing certainty that she would have to sacrifice her own happiness to save the people she loved. The words had poured out of her in a torrent of grief and fear, and she had ended by asking Samuel what he would want her to do, knowing that he would never be able to answer. But as she had stood there in the gathering dusk, Emma had felt a sense of peace settle over her that she hadn't experienced since the day they had received news of Samuel's death. It was as though her brother's presence was somehow still with her, offering the comfort and guidance that he had provided throughout their childhood. When she had finally returned to the house, her mind was made up, and she had spent the evening composing the letter that would seal her fate. The next morning, Emma had dressed in her best dress and had walked the 3 miles to town to deliver her letter to Marcus Blackwood personally. She had wanted to see his reaction when he read her acceptance of his proposal, partly out of curiosity and partly out of a need to maintain some small measure of control over the situation. Blackwood had received her in his office above the bank, a richly appointed room with heavy wooden furniture and oil paintings of hunting scenes that seemed designed to intimidate visitors and remind them of their host's wealth and power. When he had finished reading her letter, Blackwood had smiled with the satisfied expression of a man who had never doubted that he would get what he wanted. He had congratulated Emma on making what he called a wise and mature decision, and had immediately begun discussing the arrangements for their wedding. The ceremony would take place in 6 weeks, he had informed her, which would give him time to make the necessary preparations and would allow Emma to adjust to the idea of her new role as his wife. However, Blackwood had continued, there was one additional matter that needed to be addressed before their engagement could be formally announced. Given Emma's youth and the unconventional nature of their arrangement, he felt it was important to demonstrate to the community that she was entering into the marriage of her own free will and that she understood the commitment she was making. To accomplish this, he had decided to hold a public ceremony that would leave no doubt about Emma's consent and would serve to legitimize their union in the eyes of the townspeople. Emma had listened with growing alarm as Blackwood had explained his plan for what he termed a betrothal auction. The event would be held in the town hall, with the entire community invited to attend. Emma would be presented to the assembled crowd, and Blackwood would make a public offer for her hand in marriage. Other men would be invited to make competing bids, though Blackwood had assured Emma that he had more than enough resources to outbid anyone else in town. The auction would conclude with Emma formally accepting Blackwood's proposal, thus demonstrating to everyone present that she had chosen him freely rather than being coerced into the arrangement. The humiliation of such a public spectacle had been almost too much for Emma to contemplate, but Blackwood had made it clear that this was a non-negotiable condition of their agreement. He had pointed out that rumors and gossip had a way of following people throughout their lives, and he had no intention of allowing anyone to question the legitimacy of his marriage or suggest that he had taken advantage of a desperate family. The auction would ensure that no one could ever claim that Emma had been forced into the marriage against her will. Emma had returned home that day feeling as though she were trapped in a nightmare from which she couldn't wake up. The thought of standing before the entire town while men bid on her like livestock was almost unbearable. But she knew that she had already committed herself to a path from which there was no turning back. She had told her parents about her engagement to Blackwood that evening, presenting it as a fortunate turn of events that would solve all of their financial problems. Her father had initially been suspicious of Blackwood's sudden generosity, but Emma had managed to convince him that the banker had been impressed by her character and had fallen in love with her during his visits to discuss their mortgage. Weeks leading up to the auction had passed in a blur of preparation and mounting dread. Emma had tried to maintain the facade of a happy bride-to-be, accepting congratulations from neighbors and enduring fittings for the dress that Blackwood had insisted on purchasing for the occasion. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The gown was made of expensive silk in a deep blue color that complemented Emma's dark hair and fair complexion. But every time she looked at herself in the mirror while wearing it, she felt as though she were looking at a stranger. As the date of the auction approached, Emma had found herself making frequent visits to Samuel's grave, seeking comfort in the one place where she felt she could be completely honest about her fears and doubts. She had told her brother about her terror at the thought of the public ceremony, about her revulsion at the idea of being married to a man she barely knew and didn't love, and about her desperate hope that somehow she would find the strength to endure whatever lay ahead. On the morning of the auction, Emma had awakened before dawn with her heart pounding and her stomach churning with nausea. She had barely been able to eat breakfast, despite her mother's concerned efforts to make sure she had enough food to sustain her through what was sure to be an emotionally exhausting day. As she had prepared for the ceremony, Emma had caught sight of herself in the mirror and had been startled by how pale and hollow-eyed she looked, despite the careful application of rouge and powder that was meant to make her appear radiant and happy. The walk to the town hall had felt like a funeral procession, with Emma supported on either side by her parents as they made their way through streets lined with curious onlookers who had turned out to witness the spectacle. Emma had kept her eyes fixed straight ahead, unable to bear the mixture of pity, excitement, and judgment that she could see in the faces of people she had known her entire life. And now here she stood on the platform in the town hall, surrounded by the shouted bids and leering faces of men who saw her not as a person with hopes and dreams and fears, but as a prize to be won. Marcus Blackwood stood near the front of the crowd, his confident smile never wavering as he systematically outbid every other offer. Emma could see the satisfaction in his eyes as he demonstrated his wealth and power to the assembled townspeople, using her humiliation as a vehicle for asserting his dominance over the community. As the bidding reached its crescendo and Blackwood prepared to make what would surely be the final, winning offer, Emma closed her eyes and whispered a silent prayer to Samuel, begging him to somehow give her the strength to survive what was about to happen to her. The temperature in the hall seemed to drop suddenly, and Emma opened her eyes to see her breath forming small clouds in the air that had been stifling hot just moments before. The crowd began to murmur and shift restlessly as people noticed the sudden change in temperature, but Emma felt a strange sense of calm settling over her. She had the oddest feeling that she was no longer alone on the platform, that someone was standing beside her offering silent support and protection. The sensation was so strong that she turned to look, half expecting to see Samuel's familiar face smiling at her with the same loving expression he had worn throughout their childhood. What she saw instead would change everything that was about to happen, and would transform this moment of ultimate degradation into something that no one present would ever forget. The figure that materialized beside Emma on the auction platform was translucent yet unmistakably real. Visible to every person in the packed town hall, Samuel Carter stood there in the same work clothes he had worn to the textile mill on his final day, his face bearing the same gentle expression that had comforted Emma through countless childhood fears and disappointments. But there was something different about him now, an otherworldly authority that seemed to fill the space around him with an energy that made the very air crackle with tension. A woman in the front row screamed and fainted, her body crumpling to the floor as her husband caught her and frantically tried to revive her. Children began to cry and cling to their parents, while grown men who had spent their lives working in dangerous coal mines and steel mills found themselves backing toward the exits with terror written across their faces. The auctioneer's voice faltered and died as he stared at the apparition, his gavel falling from nerveless fingers to clatter on the wooden platform. But Marcus Blackwood remained where he was, his face pale but his jaw set with determination. He had not built his fortune by running from challenges, supernatural or otherwise, and he was not about to let a ghost, real or imagined, interfere with his acquisition of Emma Carter. His voice cut through the chaos like a blade as he shouted over the panicked voices of the crowd. "This is nothing more than a parlor trick designed to disrupt a legal proceeding," Blackwood declared, his educated accent carrying clearly through the hall. "I will not be deterred by superstitious nonsense or cheap theatrical effects. The auction will continue, and I will have what I came for." Samuel's ghostly form turned toward Blackwood, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of the grave and the fury of a brother who had watched his sister's torment from beyond the veil of death. "You will not touch her," he said, each word falling like a stone into the sudden silence that had descended over the hall. "Emma is under my protection, and any man who would purchase her like cattle will answer to me." The temperature in the room plummeted further, and frost began to form on the windows despite the autumn warmth outside. The oil lamps that illuminated the hall flickered and dimmed, casting eerie shadows that danced across the walls like living things. Several more people fainted, while others began pushing toward the exits in their desperation to escape the supernatural confrontation unfolding before them. Emma found her voice at last, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "Samuel? Is it really you?" Her brother's ghostly face softened as he looked at her, and for a moment he appeared almost solid, as though he might step down from whatever realm he had been inhabiting and embrace her as he had in life. "I've been watching over you, Emma. I've seen what this man has done, how he's used our family's grief and desperation to corner you into this obscene arrangement. I couldn't let it happen." Blackwood stepped forward, his face flushed with anger and frustration. "Enough of this charade. I don't care if you're a ghost, a hallucination, or an actor hired by someone who wants to interfere with my business. I have a legal agreement with this girl's family, and I intend to see it honored." Samuel's form grew more solid as his anger intensified, and the very walls of the town hall seemed to tremble in response to his fury. legal agreement? You manipulated a grieving family who were struggling to survive after my death. You used their desperation to force a girl into a marriage she doesn't want, with a man old enough to be her father. There is nothing legal or moral about what you've done here." The crowd had begun to recover from their initial shock, and murmurs of agreement with Samuel's words began to ripple through the assembled townspeople. Many of them had been uncomfortable with the auction from the beginning, but had been too intimidated by Blackwood's wealth and influence to voice their objections. Now, with a supernatural ally speaking for Emma, they found the courage to express their true feelings about the degrading spectacle they had been witnessing. "The boy's right," called out Robert Hayes, a blacksmith whose own family had narrowly avoided foreclosure on their property. "This whole business has been wrong from the start. No decent man would put a girl through such humiliation." Mary Johnson, the schoolteacher who had known Emma since childhood, stood up in her seat and added her voice to the growing chorus of dissent. "Emma Carter is a good girl from a respectable family. She deserves better than to be sold off like livestock to pay her father's debts." Blackwood's carefully constructed facade of respectability began to crumble as more and more voices joined in condemnation of his actions. He had counted on the townspeople's fear of his economic power to keep them silent, but the presence of Samuel's ghost had shifted the balance of the situation in ways he had never anticipated. His face grew red with rage as he realized that his public demonstration of dominance was turning into a humiliating defeat. "I will not be lectured by the living or the dead," Blackwood snarled, his cultured accent slipping to reveal the coarser tones of his actual background. "I have invested considerable time and resources in this arrangement, and I will not walk away empty-handed. If the girl won't come willingly, then perhaps her family needs to be reminded of what will happen if they default on their obligations to my bank." Samuel's ghostly form blazed brighter as Blackwood's threats filled the air and the frost on. The windows began to spread across the walls of the hall like crystalline fingers, reaching out to grasp the banker in their icy embrace. "You dare to threaten my family in my presence? You forget that death has freed me from the constraints that bound me in life. I no longer need to fear your lawyers or your threats of foreclosure." The ghost began to move toward Blackwood, his translucent feet leaving no trace on the wooden floor, but somehow creating the impression of inexorable forward momentum. As he advanced, the temperature continued to drop, and several of the oil lamps guttered out entirely, plunging portions of the hall into an eerie twilight broken only by the supernatural glow emanating from Samuel's form. Blackwood backed away. Despite his bravado, his primitive instincts overriding his rational mind as he found himself face to face with something that defied all his understanding of the natural world. "Stay away from me," he commanded, but his voice had lost its authority and now carried a note of genuine fear. "I offer you a choice," Samuel said, his voice echoing strangely in the frigid air. "Leave this place now, forgive my family's debt, and never trouble them again. Do this, and I will allow you to depart unharmed. Refuse, and discover what a dead man can do to protect those he loves." The crowd watched in breathless silence as the confrontation played out before them, many of them struggling to process the reality of what they were witnessing. Emma remained frozen on the platform, torn between joy at seeing her beloved brother again and terror at the supernatural forces that were being unleashed in the town hall. She wanted to call out to Samuel, to tell him how much she had missed him and how grateful she was for his protection. But something in his otherworldly presence warned her that any interruption might break the delicate balance of power that was keeping Blackwood at bay. For a long moment, the banker and the ghost stared at each other across the frozen air of the hall, neither willing to back down from the confrontation. Then, with a suddenness that caught everyone by surprise, Blackwood lunged forward and grabbed Emma's arm, pulling her roughly against his chest and wrapping his other arm around her throat. "Ghost or no ghost, I will have what is mine," he hissed into Emma's ear, his breath hot against her skin, the despite the supernatural cold that filled the hall. "If you want to protect your sister, you'll have to go through me to do it." Samuel's roar of fury shook the very foundations of the building, and every piece of glass in the town hall shattered simultaneously, sending shards cascading to the floor like deadly rain. The remaining oil lamps exploded in showers of flame and oil, and for a moment, the hall was plunged into complete darkness except for the blazing aura that surrounded the enraged ghost. When the supernatural light stabilized, the crowd could see that Samuel had somehow positioned himself directly in front of Blackwood and Emma, his ghostly hands reaching out toward the banker's throat. But instead of passing harmlessly through Blackwood's body, as everyone expected, Samuel's hands made contact with solid flesh, and the banker's eyes widened in shock and pain as the ghost's icy touch began to burn his skin. "Impossible, Blackwood," gasped, releasing his hold on Emma and stumbling backward as he clutched at his throat where Samuel's fingers had left marks that looked like frostbite. "You're dead. You can't touch the living." Samuel's laugh was like the sound of winter wind through a graveyard, cold and merciless and filled with dark promise. "I told you that death had freed me from constraints. Did you think I was speaking metaphorically? I have learned things in the realm beyond life that would freeze your blood if you could comprehend them. The love I bear for my family has given me power over the forces that separate the living from the dead." Emma found herself able to move again as Blackwood's grip on her was broken, and she rushed to put distance between herself and the banker who had tried to claim her as his property. But instead of fleeing the hall like so many of the other townspeople, she moved closer to Samuel's glowing form, drawn by the familiar love and protection that had always emanated from her brother. "Samuel," she whispered, her voice carrying clearly in the unnatural silence that had fallen over the hall. "I've missed you so much. I didn't know what to do without you." Her brother's ghostly face turned toward her, and for a moment his expression softened with the same gentle love that had defined their relationship throughout their lives. "You were never alone, Emma. I've been watching over you every day since my death, sharing your grief and your struggles. When I saw what this man was trying to do to you, I knew I had to find a way to intervene." Blackwood had recovered from his shock enough to realize that his position in the hall had become untenable. The crowd that had once been intimidated by his wealth and power was now looking at him with open hostility, and several of the larger men in the assembly were moving to block the exits to prevent his escape. The supernatural encounter had stripped away his facade of respectability and revealed him for what he truly was, a predator who preyed on the desperate and vulnerable. "This isn't over," he snarled as he began backing toward the nearest door, his eyes darting between Samuel's glowing form and the increasingly hostile crowd. "I have legal documents, binding agreements. No court in the land will accept testimony from a ghost, and without supernatural intervention, you people are powerless to stop me." Samuel's form began to solidify further, taking on an almost corporeal appearance that made him look more like a living man than a spirit of the dead. "You're right that no earthly court would accept my testimony," he said, his voice carrying a note of grim satisfaction. "But there are other kinds of justice, Marcus Blackwood. The kind that follows men like you into the darkness when your time comes to face judgment for your sins." The banker's face went white as Samuel's words hit home, and he stumbled toward the door with increasing desperation. But before he could reach the exit, a new voice cut through the tense atmosphere of the hall, calm and authoritative and completely unexpected. "Actually, there won't be any need for supernatural justice. In this case." Everyone in the hall turned to see Thomas Mitchell standing in the doorway, his blacksmith's apron still tied around his waist and his face grim with determination. He was a man of medium height but powerful build, with the kind of quiet strength that came from years of working with fire and metal. His presence brought a sense of stability to the chaotic scene, like an anchor dropped into stormy waters. Thomas had always been well respected in Millbrook, known for his honesty and his willingness to help neighbors in need. He was also known for his skill as a craftsman, his metalwork being sought after by people from neighboring towns who appreciated quality workmanship. What few people knew was that Thomas had harbored feelings for Emma Carter for nearly 2 years, feelings that he had never expressed because of his own humble circumstances and his belief that she deserved better than a simple blacksmith could provide. The engagement between Mr. Blackwood and Miss Carter is invalid, Thomas continued, stepping into the hall with a confidence that surprised everyone present. I have here a copy of the mortgage documents that Mr. Blackwood claims give him right to demand this arrangement, and I can prove that they contain fraudulent terms that would never hold up in any legitimate court of law. Blackwood's face went from white to red as Thomas's words sank in, and his voice rose to a near shriek as he realized that his carefully constructed scheme was unraveling before his eyes. That's impossible. Those documents were prepared by the finest lawyers in the state. Thomas reached into his coat and withdrew a thick sheaf of papers, holding them up for all to see. Documents that I have spent the last several weeks investigating with the help of attorneys in Pittsburgh who specialize in banking fraud. It seems that Mr. Blackwood has been using forged paperwork and illegal interest rates to force families into impossible situations, then swooping in to claim their properties and other assets when they inevitably default on payments they were never legally obligated to make. The crowd began to murmur with renewed interest as Thomas's revelation added another layer of drama to an already extraordinary evening. Emma found herself staring at the blacksmith with a mixture of confusion and gratitude, wondering how he had come to possess such detailed knowledge of her family's financial affairs, and why he had gone to such trouble to investigate Blackwood's business practices. Samuel's ghostly form had begun to fade slightly as the immediate threat to Emma appeared to be resolving itself through earthly means, but his voice still carried clearly through the hall as he addressed Thomas directly. You have done my family a great service, Thomas Mitchell. I won't forget your kindness to my sister. Thomas looked directly at the ghost without any sign of fear or disbelief, as though conversing with spirits of the dead was a perfectly normal part of his daily routine. Samuel Carter was a good man who deserved better than the death he received. His family deserves better than the treatment they've received from predators like Blackwood. I'm simply doing what any decent man would do in these circumstances. Emma felt her heart racing as she listened to this exchange between her dead brother and the man who had apparently been working behind the scenes to save her family from ruin. The day that had begun with such horror and humiliation was taking on an entirely different character, though she was still struggling to process all the revelations that were coming at her in rapid succession. Blackwood made one last desperate attempt to salvage his scheme, his voice taking on the wheedling tone of a man who had realized that his position was hopeless but was unwilling to accept defeat. Even if there are irregularities in the paperwork, the girl's family still owes money to my bank. Without some form of compensation, they will still face foreclosure and ruin. It was at this moment that Samuel's ghostly form blazed with renewed intensity, and his voice carried the authority of judgment itself as he delivered what would be his final words in the realm of the living. The debt is forgiven, Marcus Blackwood. Consider it payment for the wages you stole from me through unsafe working conditions and fraudulent employment contracts. My death was no accident, as we both know, and the blood money you saved by cutting corners on safety equipment more than covers anything my family might owe you. With these words, Samuel began to fade from view, but not before turning to Emma one last time with an expression of infinite love and compassion. Be happy, sister. Live the life I never got to have, and know that I will always be watching over you. Emma reached out toward her brother's disappearing form, tears streaming down her face as she whispered, "Thank you, Samuel. I love you." And then he was gone, leaving behind only the memory of his protective presence and the lingering scent of the flowers that had grown wild on his grave. The temperature in the hall began to return to normal, and the supernatural tension that had gripped the assembly slowly dissipated, like morning mist before the rising sun. Blackwood stood alone in the center of the hall, surrounded by hostile faces and stripped of both his supernatural threat and his legal justification for his actions. Without another word, he turned and fled through the nearest exit, his expensive shoes slipping on the broken glass that littered the floor as he made his ignominious escape from Millbrook. As the immediate crisis passed and the crowd began to disperse, Emma found herself face to face with Thomas Mitchell, the man who had saved her family through his investigation and intervention. She had known him by sight for most of her life, but had never really paid attention to him as anything more than one of the many hard-working men who kept the town functioning. Now, as she looked into his steady brown eyes and saw the genuine concern written across his weathered features, began to understand that there was much more to Thomas Mitchell than she had ever realized. The auction platform that had been the site of her humiliation and supernatural salvation now seemed like a world away from the quiet conversation that began between Emma and Thomas as the town hall slowly emptied around them. Neither of them yet knew where this unexpected turn of events would lead, but both understood that something fundamental had shifted in their lives and in their understanding of what the future might hold. The ghost of Samuel Carter had departed from the realm of the living, but his protective love for his sister had set in motion a chain of events that would transform not only Emma's fate, but the entire trajectory of her family's future. Auction that had been intended to seal her doom had instead become the catalyst for her liberation, and the man who had stepped forward to defend her honor would soon become much more than just another face in the crowd of Millbrook's hard-working citizens. As Emma and Thomas began to talk quietly in the aftermath of this supernatural confrontation, neither of them noticed the single white flower that had appeared on the auction platform where Samuel's ghostly form had stood. It was a bloom that had never grown in the soil around Millbrook, a flower from some otherworldly garden that would remain fresh and beautiful long after every other trace of that extraordinary evening had faded from memory. The morning after the supernatural events at the town hall dawned gray and cold, with heavy clouds promising the season's first serious snowfall. Emma awakened in her narrow bed, feeling as though she had lived through a vivid dream, until she noticed the faint scent of otherworldly flowers still clinging to her hair and dress. The events of the previous evening came flooding back with startling clarity, and she found herself sitting up abruptly, her heart racing as she tried to process everything that had happened. From downstairs came the sound of voices, more animated and hopeful than any conversation she had heard in the Carter household since Samuel's death. Emma dressed quickly and made her way to the kitchen, where she found her parents seated at the worn wooden table with Thomas Mitchell, sharing what appeared to be the first genuine meal the family had enjoyed in months. Her father's face had lost the haggard expression that had become his constant companion, and her mother was actually smiling as she poured coffee from their best china pot. Thomas rose politely when Emma entered the room, his calloused hands smoothing down his work shirt in a gesture that spoke of nervous respect rather than casual familiarity. He had cleaned up considerably since the previous evening, trading his leather apron for a neat wool vest and taking obvious care with his appearance. When he spoke, his voice carried the same quiet authority that had impressed Emma during his confrontation with Blackwood, but there was also a gentleness that she hadn't noticed before. "Miss Carter," he said, inclining his head formally, "I hope you slept well after everything that happened yesterday. Your parents have been kind enough to invite me for breakfast so we could discuss the situation with your family's finances and what needs to be done going forward." William Carter looked up from his plate with an expression Emma hadn't seen on his face since before Samuel's death. For the first time in months, her father appeared to be a man who believed he had a future worth planning for. "Emma, sit down and eat something," Thomas has brought us news that changes everything for our family. As Emma took her place at the table, Thomas began to explain the results of his investigation into Marcus Blackwood's business practices. He had spent nearly 3 weeks traveling to Pittsburgh and consulting with lawyers who specialized in banking fraud, using his own savings to pay for their expertise. What he had discovered was a pattern of illegal activity that stretched back several years and affected dozens of families throughout the region. Blackwood had been using forged documents and fraudulent interest calculations to create debts that were far larger than what families had actually borrowed. He would then offer to help struggling families by extending their payment deadlines, but only in exchange for additional collateral or personal guarantees that gave him leverage over their entire households. When families inevitably defaulted on the impossible payments, Blackwood would swoop in to claim their properties, their businesses, and in some cases, their children as indentured servants. The lawyers Thomas had consulted were preparing to file criminal charges against Blackwood and were confident that they could prove fraud in dozens of cases. More importantly for the Carter family, they had determined that the original mortgage on the farm contained so many illegal provisions that the entire debt could be declared void. Rather than owing $800 to Blackwood's bank, the family actually owed nothing at all, and might even be entitled to compensation for the illegal interest they had already paid. Emma listened to this explanation with growing amazement, struggling to comprehend that their desperate situation had not only been resolved, but had been transformed into something approaching prosperity. The farm that she had expected to lose was now secure, and the family that had been facing destitution was instead looking at the possibility of financial stability for the first time in years. But as grateful as she was for Thomas's intervention, Emma found herself puzzled by his motivations. The investigation he had undertaken would have required considerable time, money, and effort, with no guarantee of success. She couldn't understand why a man who barely knew her family would have gone to such lengths to help them, especially when he had his own business and responsibilities to attend to. When she asked him about this directly, Thomas's weathered face reddened slightly, and he took a long moment to consider his response. When he finally spoke, his words came slowly and carefully, as though he were afraid of saying too much or revealing more than he intended. "Your brother Samuel was a good man," Thomas said finally. "He came to my shop several times when he was working at the textile mill, bringing metalwork that needed repair and always paying fairly for the service. We got to talking during those visits, and he mentioned his concerns about Blackwood's treatment of your family. Samuel was worried that something wasn't right about the mortgage terms, but he didn't have the resources or connections to investigate properly." Thomas paused and glanced at Emma before continuing. "After Samuel's death, I felt like I owed it to his memory to look into the situation. A man doesn't die in a preventable accident without someone being held accountable, and I suspected that Blackwood's cost-cutting measures at the mill might have contributed to what happened. The investigation into the mortgage fraud was just part of a larger effort to expose Blackwood's illegal activities." Emma's mother reached across the table to pat Thomas's hand gratefully. "Whatever your reasons, you've saved this family from ruin. We can never repay you for what you've done." But Thomas shook his head firmly. "I don't want repayment, Mrs. Carter. Seeing justice done and knowing that your family is safe is compensation enough for me." As the conversation continued, Emma found herself studying Thomas with new interest. She had always thought of him as simply another of the town's craftsmen, a man who worked with his hands and lived a quiet, unremarkable life. But his intervention in their crisis had revealed layers of character and capability that she had never suspected. The careful planning required for his investigation, the financial resources he had committed to helping strangers, and the courage he had shown in confronting Blackwood all spoke to a depth of character that impressed her more than she cared to admit. Over the following days, Thomas became a regular visitor to the Carter household as he helped the family navigate the legal process of formally challenging Blackwood's fraudulent claims. He accompanied William Carter to meetings with lawyers in Pittsburgh, translated complex legal documents into terms the family could understand, and served as an intermediary with the authorities who were building their criminal case against the disgraced banker. During these visits, Emma found herself drawn into conversations with Thomas that ranged far beyond the immediate legal issues. She learned that he had taught himself to read and write after his apprenticeship ended, spending his evenings studying books borrowed from the homes of wealthier customers. He had educated himself about law, business, and even literature, driven by a curiosity about the world that extended far beyond the boundaries of Millbrook. Thomas had grown up as an orphan, taken in by the town's previous blacksmith when he was barely 12 years old. He had learned his trade through hard work and natural aptitude, eventually buying out his mentor's business when the older man decided to retire. Despite his humble beginnings, Thomas had built a reputation that extended throughout the region, with customers traveling considerable distances to commission his work. What impressed Emma most was Thomas's quiet ambition and his vision for the future. He wasn't content to simply maintain his existing business, but was constantly looking for ways to improve his techniques and expand his services. He had been saving money for several years with the goal of opening a larger workshop that could handle more complex projects and employ additional craftsmen. His dream was to create something that would outlast his own lifetime, a business that could provide employment and stability for other young men who found themselves in circumstances similar to his own childhood. As Emma learned more about Thomas's character and aspirations, she began to see him not just as the man who had saved her family, but as someone whose company she genuinely enjoyed. Their conversations revealed a quick wit and gentle humor that made even the most mundane topics interesting. Thomas had a way of listening that made Emma feel heard and valued, a stark contrast to the dismissive treatment she had received from most of the men in her acquaintance. The contrast with Marcus Blackwood could not have been more pronounced. Where Blackwood had seen Emma as a possession to be acquired, Thomas treated her as an equal whose opinions and feelings mattered. Where Blackwood had used his wealth and power to intimidate and coerce, Thomas offered his help freely and asked for nothing in return. Where Blackwood had represented everything that was calculating and predatory about the world of business and finance, Thomas embodied the values of honest work, fair dealing, and genuine concern for others. But Emma was also aware that her growing appreciation for Thomas's character was complicated by the circumstances of their acquaintance. She had been rescued from a degrading situation by his intervention, and she worried that her gratitude might be influencing her feelings in ways that weren't entirely healthy or genuine. The last thing she wanted was to mistake relief and thankfulness for something deeper and more lasting. These concerns were brought into sharp focus when Thomas approached her father about a matter that had nothing to do with legal documents or criminal investigations. It was a crisp November afternoon, with the first snow of winter beginning to dust the bare branches of the oak trees around the farmhouse. Emma was helping her mother prepare preserves in the kitchen when she heard the two men talking in low, serious tones in the parlor. William Carter's voice carried clearly through the thin walls as he invited Thomas to speak freely about whatever was on his mind. Thomas's response was more difficult to hear, but Emma caught enough words to understand that he was asking for permission to court her formally. The conversation that followed was conducted in the careful, respectful manner of men who understood the importance of proper procedures and family honor. Emma found herself holding her breath as she listened to her father's questions about Thomas's intentions, his financial prospects, and his plans for the future. Thomas answered each inquiry with the same honesty and directness that had characterized all of his dealings with the family, outlining his business goals, his savings, and his desire to provide well for a wife and children. When William Carter asked directly whether Thomas believed he could make Emma happy, the blacksmith's response was so quiet that Emma had to strain to hear it. "I can't promise to make her happy, sir. That's not something any man can guarantee. But I can promise to respect her, to work hard to provide for her, and to love her with everything I have. If she have me, I'll spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of her trust." Emma felt her heart racing as she absorbed the implications of this conversation. The man who had saved her from a forced marriage to Marcus Blackwood was now asking for the opportunity to win her heart through honest courtship. The contrast between the two approaches to marriage couldn't have been more stark, and Emma found herself both moved by Thomas's respectful manner and terrified by the decision she would soon be asked to make. Her father's response was warm, but cautious. He expressed his gratitude for everything Thomas had done for the family and his respect for the younger man's character. But he also made it clear that the decision would ultimately rest with Emma herself, and that no pressure would be placed on her to accept or reject Thomas's suit. When the conversation in the parlor concluded and Thomas prepared to leave, Emma made a decision that surprised even herself. Instead of avoiding him or pretending she hadn't overheard the discussion with her father, she stepped out onto the front porch and asked if she could speak with him privately. Thomas looked surprised, but pleased by her initiative, and they walked together toward the small family cemetery where Samuel was buried. Emma had found herself drawn to this spot frequently since her brother's supernatural appearance, finding comfort in the peaceful setting and the sense of connection it provided to Samuel's memory. Standing beside her brother's grave, Emma spoke honestly about her confusion and uncertainty regarding Thomas's proposal. She expressed her gratitude for everything he had done for her family, but also her concern that gratitude might not be a solid foundation for marriage. She told him about her fear that she might be unable to distinguish between genuine affection and relief at being rescued from an impossible situation. Thomas listened to her concerns without interruption, his weathered hands clasped behind his back as he considered her words carefully. When she finished speaking, he was quiet for several minutes, gazing thoughtfully at Samuel's headstone before responding. "I understand your concerns, Emma, and I think they do you credit," he said finally. "A woman who would marry a man out of gratitude alone wouldn't be the kind of person I'd want as a wife. The fact that you're questioning your own motivations tells me that your heart is in the right place." He turned to face her directly, his brown eyes serious but kind. "I'm not asking you to marry me tomorrow, or even to accept my proposal today. What I'm asking for is the chance to court you properly, to spend time together so we can both learn whether what we feel is genuine affection or just the result of unusual circumstances." Emma found herself nodding as Thomas continued. "If, after a reasonable period of courtship, you decide that you don't care for me in the way a wife should care for her husband, I'll accept that decision with good grace and no hard feelings. But if you refuse to even consider the possibility of a relationship between us, we'll never know what might have developed." The reasonableness of Thomas's proposal appealed to Emma's practical nature, while his patience and understanding touched something deeper in her heart. She had expected pressure or urgency, the kind of masculine insistence that demanded immediate answers to complex questions. Instead, Thomas was offering her time and space to make her own decision, free from external pressure or artificial deadlines. "I think I would like that," Emma said quietly. "The chance to get to know you better, I mean. To see if what I'm feeling is real or just the result of everything that's happened." Thomas's face lit up with a smile that transformed his serious features into something approaching boyish enthusiasm. "That's all I could ask for, Emma. That's more than I dared to hope." As they walked back toward the farmhouse together, Emma felt a sense of possibility that she hadn't experienced since before Samuel's death. The future that had seemed so bleak and predetermined just days earlier was now open and full of potential. She had the luxury of choice, the gift of time, and the prospect of discovering whether the man who had saved her from one fate might also be the key to a happiness she had never dared to imagine. The courtship that began that afternoon would unfold slowly and carefully, with both Emma and Thomas taking pains to ensure that their growing relationship was built on solid ground rather than dramatic circumstances. They would face challenges and obstacles, moments of doubt and uncertainty, but they would also discover depths of compatibility and affection that neither had expected. But perhaps most importantly, Emma would gradually come to understand that Samuel's supernatural intervention had given her something far more valuable than rescue from an unwanted marriage. Her brother's ghostly appearance had created the circumstances that allowed her to meet the man who would become not just her husband, but her partner in building the kind of life that honored both the past and the future. Winter settled over Millbrook with an intensity that reminded everyone why the old-timers spoke of 1892 as one of the harshest seasons in memory. The coal shortages that had plagued the town since the mine closures became critical as temperatures plummeted and stayed below freezing for weeks at a time. Ice formed thick enough on the river to support loaded wagons, and the wind carried a bite that seemed to cut through even the heaviest wool coats like they were made of paper. For the Carter family, however, this winter brought a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire crackling in their hearth. The resolution of their financial troubles had lifted a burden from their shoulders that they hadn't fully realized they were carrying until it was gone. William Carter moved with the confident stride of a man who owned his land free and clear, while his wife hummed old songs as she worked, melodies that hadn't been heard in their house since before Samuel's death. Emma found herself settling into the rhythm of courtship with Thomas Mitchell, a process that proved to be both more complex and more rewarding than she had anticipated. Their relationship developed through small moments and quiet conversations rather than grand gestures or dramatic declarations. Thomas would arrive at the farm in the early evening after finishing his work at the blacksmith shop, often carrying some small token that demonstrated his thoughtfulness, a book he thought she might enjoy, fresh bread from the bakery, or a piece of metalwork that served both practical and decorative purposes. These gifts revealed aspects of Thomas's character that impressed Emma more with each passing week. The books he selected showed that he had been paying attention to her interests and opinions, choosing volumes of poetry when she mentioned her love of verse, or works of natural philosophy when their conversations turned to questions about the world beyond Millbrook. The practical items he crafted with his own hands demonstrated both his skill as an artisan and his desire to contribute something meaningful to her daily life. One particularly memorable evening, Thomas arrived with a delicate iron flower that he had forged in his shop. The piece was remarkable in its detail, with each petal individually shaped and textured to create an almost lifelike appearance. When Emma asked what had inspired him to create such a piece, Thomas explained that he had been thinking about the supernatural flower that had appeared on the auction platform after Samuel's departure, and had wanted to create something that would capture its beauty in a more permanent form. The gesture touched Emma deeply, not just because of the artistry involved, but because it showed that Thomas understood the significance of her brother's supernatural visit and wanted to honor that memory in his own way. The iron flower became a treasured possession, displayed prominently on the mantel where it caught the firelight and seemed to glow with an inner radiance that reminded Emma of Samuel's otherworldly presence. As their courtship progressed, Emma began to appreciate Thomas's approach to their relationship. He never pressured her for declarations of love or pushed for physical intimacy beyond the occasional touch of hands or brief embrace. Instead, he seemed content to let their connection develop naturally, focusing on building a foundation of friendship and mutual respect that could support whatever deeper feelings might grow between them. Their conversations during these winter evenings ranged across topics that Emma had never discussed with any man before. Thomas was genuinely interested in her thoughts about books, politics, religion, and the future of their community. He asked for her opinions on his business decisions and listened carefully to her suggestions, treating her insights with the same respect he would show to an equal partner, rather than dismissing them as the naive musings of a sheltered young woman. This intellectual compatibility proved to be just as important as their growing emotional connection. Emma discovered that Thomas possessed a curious mind and a hunger for knowledge that matched her own. He had taught himself not just reading and writing, but also mathematics, basic engineering principles, and even some Latin from books borrowed from the minister. His self-education had been driven by a desire to improve his craft and expand his business, but it had also given him a breadth of knowledge that made him an engaging conversationalist. One evening in late December, as they sat before the fireplace discussing Thomas's plans for expanding his workshop, Emma realized that she was no longer questioning whether her feelings for him were genuine. The gradual deepening of their relationship had allowed her to separate her gratitude for his rescue of her family from her growing affection for him as a person. She found herself looking forward to his visits with an anticipation that had nothing to do with obligation or debt, and missing his company on the evenings when his work kept him away. But their courtship was not without its challenges. The dramatic circumstances of their first meaningful interaction had created expectations and gossip within the community that sometimes made their relationship feel like a public spectacle rather than a private matter. Some of the townspeople viewed their courtship as a romantic fairy tale, the natural conclusion to the supernatural drama that had unfolded at the town hall. Others were more skeptical, wondering whether Emma was simply transferring her gratitude from one rescue to another kind of dependence. These external pressures came to a head during the community's Christmas celebration, when Emma and Thomas attended the church social together for the first time as an acknowledged courting couple. The event was held in the same town hall where the auction had taken place just 2 months earlier, though the space had been decorated with evergreen boughs and candles that transformed its atmosphere completely. Throughout the evening, Emma was aware of the whispered conversations and speculative glances that followed them as they moved through the crowd. Some of the comments were kind and supportive, with neighbors expressing their happiness at seeing the Carter family's fortunes improve and Emma's obvious contentment with Thomas's courtship. But others carried undertones of doubt or judgment that made Emma feel as though her relationship was being evaluated and discussed like a business transaction. The situation reached a breaking point when Catherine Mills, one of the town's most notorious gossips, approached Emma with what she clearly intended as friendly conversation, but which felt more like an interrogation. Mrs. Mills's questions about the speed of their courtship, the convenience of Thomas's appearance in Emma's life, and whether she was certain of her feelings were delivered with a smile, but carried implications that stung more than outright criticism would have. Thomas, who had been standing nearby talking with some of the other men, noticed Emma's discomfort and smoothly intervened in the conversation. His response to Mrs. Mills was polite but firm, making it clear that he considered any discussion of his and Emma's private feelings to be inappropriate and unwelcome. The authority in his voice and the protective way he positioned himself near Emma sent a clear message to the rest of the gathering that their relationship was not open for public debate. Later, as they walked home through the snow-covered streets, Emma thanked Thomas for his intervention but also expressed her frustration with the community's fascination with their personal lives. She had hoped that the dramatic events of the auction would eventually fade from public memory, allowing them to develop their relationship without constant scrutiny and commentary. Thomas listened to her concerns with the same careful attention. He brought to all their conversations, then offered a perspective that surprised her with its wisdom and maturity. He pointed out that their relationship had begun under extraordinary circumstances that naturally attracted attention and speculation. Rather than resenting this interest, they could choose to view it as an opportunity to demonstrate that genuine love and respect could grow from even the most unusual beginnings. People are watching us because they want to believe that good things can come from bad situations, Thomas said as they paused beneath a street lamp whose light cast dancing shadows on the falling snow. Our happiness gives them hope for their own futures. If we can build something real and lasting together, it proves that even the darkest circumstances can lead to joy. Emma found herself moved by this perspective, which reframed the community's attention as something positive rather than intrusive. She began to understand that their relationship carried significance beyond their own personal happiness, serving as a symbol of resilience and hope for a town that had endured considerable hardship in recent years. This realization helped Emma approach the final stages of their courtship with greater confidence and clarity. Instead of worrying about whether her feelings were sufficiently independent of the circumstances that brought them together, she began to focus on the reality of their compatibility and the strength of the connection they had built through months of careful attention to each other's needs and desires. The turning point came during a blizzard in January that trapped them together at the Carter farmhouse for 3 days. Thomas had been making his usual evening visit when the storm struck with unexpected fury, making travel impossible and forcing him to accept the family's hospitality for an extended stay. The experience of living in close quarters during the emergency gave Emma a chance to observe Thomas in circumstances that revealed new dimensions of his character. During those 3 days, Thomas proved himself to be not just a welcome guest, but a valuable member of the household. He helped William Carter repair a section of roof that had been damaged by the weight of accumulated snow, worked alongside Emma's mother in preparing meals from their limited supplies, and entertained the family with stories and songs during the long evenings when they were confined indoors. Emma was particularly impressed by Thomas's easy relationship with her parents, who had clearly come to regard him as more than just their daughter's suitor. Her father sought Thomas's advice on farm management and business matters, while her mother included him in family decisions and treated him with the affection she might show to a son. The natural way that Thomas fit into their family dynamic gave Emma a preview of what married life might be like, and she found the prospect more appealing than she had dared to hope. On the final evening of the storm, as they sat around the fireplace listening to the wind howl outside, Emma made a decision that surprised even herself. When Thomas began to speak about their future together in tentative, hypothetical terms, she interrupted him with a directness that left no room for misunderstanding. "Thomas," she said, her voice steady despite the racing of her heart, "I don't want to spend any more time wondering about possibilities or worrying about other people's opinions. I know my own mind, and I know my own heart. If you're asking me to marry you, then my answer is yes." The silence that followed her declaration was broken only by the crackling of the fire and the distant sound of wind-driven snow against the windows. Thomas stared at her with an expression of joy and disbelief, as though he couldn't quite accept that she had spoken the words he had been hoping to hear for months. When he finally found his voice, it was to ask whether she was certain of her decision, whether she had considered all the implications, whether she needed more time to think about such an important choice. Emma's response was to reach for his hands and speak with a conviction that left no doubt about her feelings. "I've had months to think about it, Thomas. I've watched how you treat my family, how you approach your work, how you handle both success and difficulty. I've seen your kindness, your integrity, your patience, and your strength. I'm not marrying you out of gratitude or convenience or because I feel like I should. I'm marrying you because I love you and because I can't imagine building a future with anyone else." The kiss they shared in front of the fireplace, witnessed by Emma's parents who had been pretending not to listen to their conversation, sealed an engagement that felt both inevitable and miraculous. It was a moment that transformed their careful courtship into something deeper and more permanent, a commitment that would shape the rest of their lives. The announcement of their engagement was met with widespread approval throughout Millbrook, though Emma suspected that some of the enthusiasm was motivated more by relief than genuine happiness. The community had invested considerable emotional energy in their relationship, and their decision to marry provided a satisfying conclusion to a story that had begun with such drama and uncertainty. Plans for the wedding began immediately, with Emma's mother throwing herself into preparations with an enthusiasm that revealed how much she had been hoping for this outcome. The ceremony would be held in the spring, after the worst of the winter weather had passed, and when the farm work would be lighter, allowing for a proper celebration. As Emma began to plan for her new life as Thomas's wife, she found herself thinking often about Samuel and the supernatural intervention that had made their love possible. Her brother's ghostly appearance had saved her from a fate worse than death, but it had also created the circumstances that allowed her to discover a happiness she had never dared to imagine. The iron flower that Thomas had crafted still sat on the mantel, catching the firelight and glowing with the same mysterious radiance that had characterized Samuel's otherworldly presence. Emma took it as a sign that her brother approved of her choice, that his protective love extended beyond the grave to encompass her future happiness as well as her immediate safety. Winter was finally beginning to loosen its grip on Millbrook, and Emma could feel the promise of spring in the lengthening days and the subtle changes in the quality of the light. Soon the snow would melt, the ground would thaw, and new life would emerge from the earth that had seemed frozen and lifeless for so many months. Emma's own life was following a similar pattern, emerging from a period of darkness and despair into something bright with possibility. The future that had once seemed so constrained and predetermined was now open and full of promise, shaped by choices made freely and love given willingly rather than circumstances imposed by others. April brought the kind of gentle sunshine that made everyone in Millbrook forget the harshness of the winter that had finally released its grip on the town. The wedding of Emma Carter and Thomas Mitchell was set for the third Saturday of the month, when the apple trees would be in full bloom, and the ground would be soft enough for the feast tables to be set up outdoors behind the church. Emma stood before the mirror in her childhood bedroom, wearing the wedding dress that had belonged to her grandmother, altered to fit her slender frame, but still carrying the elegant lines that had made it beautiful 50 years earlier. The ivory silk caught the morning light streaming through her window, and the delicate lace at the collar and sleeves added touches of refinement that transformed the simple gown into something truly special. Her mother entered the room carrying a small wooden box that Emma had never seen before. Inside, nestled in faded velvet, lay a string of pearls that seemed to glow with their own inner light. "These were your grandmother's," her mother explained, her voice thick with emotion. "She wore them on her wedding day, and her mother before her. Samuel found them in the attic last year and asked me to save them for your wedding day." Emma's breath caught as her mother fastened the pearls around her neck. The cool weight of them against her skin felt like a blessing from generations of women who had loved and been loved, who had built families and weathered storms, and found joy in the simple act of choosing their own futures. She touched the smooth surface of the largest pearl and felt a connection to her family's history that went far deeper than the troubles that had nearly destroyed them. Outside, the church bells began to ring, calling the community to witness the marriage that had become a symbol of hope and renewal for the entire town. Emma could hear the sounds of people gathering in the churchyard, their voices carrying the excitement and anticipation that always surrounded a wedding but seemed particularly intense for this one. As she prepared to leave her childhood home for the last time as an unmarried woman, Emma felt a presence in the room that was both familiar and comforting. The temperature didn't drop, and no ghostly figure materialized, but she knew with absolute certainty that Samuel was there, watching over her on this most important day of her life. "Thank you," she whispered to the empty air. Knowing that her brother would understand, she was grateful, not just for his supernatural intervention months earlier, but for the love and protection he'd always provided throughout their lives together. The walk to the church took her past the cemetery where Samuel was buried, and Emma paused for a moment beside his grave. Someone had placed fresh wildflowers on the headstone, and she suspected that Thomas had visited earlier that morning to pay his respects to the brother he had never met in life, but who had made their love possible. The church was packed with people from Millbrook and the surrounding farms, all eager to witness the marriage that had grown from such extraordinary circumstances. Emma saw faces she had known since childhood, neighbors who had watched her grow up and who now beamed with pride as she walked down the aisle toward the man who would be her husband. Thomas stood waiting at the altar, resplendent in a new suit that emphasized his broad shoulders and honest face. His expression as he watched her approach was one of wonder and gratitude, as though he couldn't quite believe that this moment was really happening. When she reached his side and placed her hand in his, Emma felt the last of her doubts and fears fall away like autumn leaves before the wind. The ceremony itself was simple but meaningful, conducted by Pastor Williams, who had known both families for decades. The vows they exchanged were traditional words, but they carried the weight of everything they had experienced together and the promise of everything they hoped to build in the years ahead. When Thomas slipped the gold band onto Emma's finger, she noticed that it was inscribed with tiny flowers that matched the iron bloom he had created for her months earlier. The attention to detail and the connection to their shared history made the ring more precious than any jewel could have been. The celebration that followed was unlike anything Millbrook had seen in years. Tables groaned under the weight of food, contributed by families throughout the community, and musicians played late into the evening as couples danced on the grass beneath strings of lanterns. Children ran between the tables chasing fireflies, and old men told stories while sharing bottles of whiskey that had been saved for special occasions. Emma and Thomas moved through their reception like people in a dream, accepting congratulations and best wishes while stealing moments alone to marvel at the reality of their new status as husband and wife. As the evening wore on and the celebration showed no signs of ending, they slipped away from the crowd to walk alone in the garden behind the church. "Do you think Samuel approves?" Emma asked as they paused beside a flowering apple tree whose blossoms glowed white in the moonlight. Thomas considered the question seriously before answering. "I think he's proud of the woman you've become and happy that you chose love over fear. He gave you the chance to make your own choice, and you chose well." As if in response to his words, a single white blossom fell from the tree above them, landing in Emma's outstretched palm. It was the same variety of flower that had appeared on the auction platform after Samuel's departure, and Emma knew it was his way of giving his blessing to their union. The newlyweds spent their first night as a married couple in the room above Thomas's workshop that he had been preparing for months to serve as their temporary home. They would build a proper house on the land adjacent to the Carter farm once Thomas's expanded business was fully established, but for now they were content with the simple apartment that overlooked the main street of Millbrook. As Emma fell asleep in her husband's arms, she thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment. Less than a year earlier, she had stood on an auction platform facing a future that promised nothing but humiliation and despair. Tonight, she lay beside a man who loved and respected her in a home they would build together, with a future full of possibilities they would explore as partners. The ghost of Samuel Carter had departed from the world of the living, but his love for his sister had created ripples that would extend far beyond that supernatural night in the town hall. Emma and Thomas would name their first son Samuel, ensuring that his memory lived on in the next generation. Their marriage would become a foundation of strength and stability in Millbrook, with Thomas's expanding business providing employment for young men and Emma's involvement in community affairs, making a difference in countless lives. Years later, when people told the story of the virgin who was auctioned to the highest bidder until her brother's ghost appeared, they would focus on the dramatic supernatural elements and the romance that grew from tragedy. But Emma would always remember the deeper truth, that love, whether from the living or the dead, has the power to transform even the darkest circumstances into something beautiful and lasting. The iron flower still sat on their mantle decades later, catching the firelight and glowing with mysterious radiance, a reminder that some bonds transcend death, and that the greatest victories are often won not through force or wealth, but through the simple courage to choose love over fear. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.